Good afternoon or good evening. When I was preparing, I asked Jean and Dan what should I talk about, and then they told me that, oh, please talk about your life. And I said, oh no, not about my life. But they said that it will be interesting. I don't know whether it will be interesting really, but then I decided that I will shortly tell you how I started this work, because, well, sometimes it gives some hint for people. As Tim mentioned, I come from Poland, and when I was born, Poland was communist society. So I was going to school, and the communism fell in when I was 16, and at that time I went to high school. So my childhood years, I remember the worst part, when the martial law was introduced and really the regime clamped down on the opposition in Poland. Then simply going to high school, about the time of graduation, I was thinking which subject to choose, and because it was soon after the transformation, many of my colleagues chose law because it was the most popular and very needed at that time in this kind of transitional, society. And I thought like, oh no, not a law, I don't want to be like them. So I chose Korean studies, just out of the blue. And at that time, generally there were Korean studies at the Warsaw University, but of course these were North Korean studies. My predecessors, they were taught by North Korean professors, and I was the first year that entered university and was taught by South Korean professors. It was simply the South Korean foundation started to send the professors, started to send books and films and programs for teaching Korean, and North Koreans realized that, oh, they don't want to teach together with South Koreans, and they withdrew. So I didn't have any opportunity. But then there was a problem, because my colleagues, who were my sonbe, like in Korean you call it sonbe, they really liked one North Korean professor, and when North Korean embassy told him to leave Poland, he didn't really want to go, and he asked the students to write a letter requesting that he and his family would be sent back again to Poland, that they liked him so much. And but he said that he has to go back because of his family. And then he went back, and a few months later, the North Korean embassy showed up at the Korean department, really angry and asking the students why did they write the letter, and that the professor disappeared. So they actually blamed the students and kind of suspected that they did something. We suspected that something happened, of course, to the professor, but that was actually for me a momentum when I started to dig into the issue. Of course, it was just the beginning of the internet and so on at that time, because it was just the beginning of the 90s. And the first report that I have found were Amnesty International, some of the human rights reports, and then some kind of testimonies that were actually posted by Citizens Alliance, where I work now, which was established in '96. And so after graduation, I really wanted to do this kind of work, but then when you have a society in which you have so strong influence also of the, and relations with North Korea, a lot of politicians and members of academia and so on still maintained contacts with North Korea, so they were not really favorable to people who wanted to do some kind of human rights work on North Korea. I simply decided to do some human rights course from the organization that its members were actually underground during in opposition, and they were advisors to the Solidarity and Lech Wałęsa, and they were writing the first human rights reports that were sent during communist times to the Western world about what's going on in Poland. So after the transition, they surfaced and they started to do a lot of educational program because society needs a lot of training, actually, this kind of society. And so I took this program, and then what? Like really, I still didn't know what to do. And then I can tell you, I was a really shy person, so it was weird for me. And of course, in such society, there wasn't even a spirit of volunteering, for example, yet. So I didn't really know what to do, whether to go somewhere and start something just like that, start volunteering, start doing what. But what happened was that by just, I think, luck, or maybe not, Citizens Alliance wanted to organize a conference in Poland on North Korean human rights issues and on refugee issues, because they do that as a yearly project. And that organization that I took the training from, they wanted me, of course, to be a coordinator, as a person who knows about Korea and so on. So I was coordinator, and then I was invited to start working here. And so the story became very simple, because what I wanted to really do, it's just, yeah, you know, I really didn't know what to do. It just, opportunities came. But I think in many cases, sometimes probably you face this kind of, you probably very often think like, what can I do really? Where can I start? And it's just the beginning, just going and meeting someone, and then it just goes. Because then opportunities come, you meet people, and then, you know, the whole story evolves. When I came here in 2004, it was just the beginning when the international society started to really recognize how serious the issue of human rights in North Korea is. And before I even came here, I went with previous organization from Poland, Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, to lobby on the resolution in Geneva, the resolution that would condemn the human rights violations. And so out of these conferences also grew the network of people that would, and just individuals, even students and NGOs that would gather once a year in Geneva, and they would lobby the diplomats, convincing them that such resolution is really important. So in the beginning, it was really a big group. We had also an NKnet there, and really people around the world, from around the world, and then, but it was really difficult because we had, like, for example, 10, 15 people. We had to divide, you know, the countries, African countries, those who spoke, for example, French, those who were better in Spanish, and those who were speaking English, and then divide into African countries, Latin American countries, and then European countries and others, and then just go to them and then give them reports, brief them about the situation, and request them to support the resolution. It was very difficult at that time because many countries, I mean, apart from like Western countries, many countries didn't want to have any country-specific resolution. And still, many countries do not want to have this kind of resolution. They say that it's just naming and shaming doesn't work of the country. That rather engagement, or there are other procedures that we can engage that country, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the resolution. And so in the beginning it was really difficult, and also by the fact that there wasn't much information in the media, there weren't many reports as well, many movies hasn't yet been done, so it was very difficult to kind of show these people who are far away there in Geneva how important this issue is. Because when you have something like, for example, Syria these days on TV, then, you know, it's just, you have cameras, you have journalists there, and this becomes a huge issue. While in North Korea, these human rights problems are even bigger but you don't have cameras there, and nobody reports on that. And then so they think like, this problem doesn't really exist, you exaggerate it. We started to go there every year, and in 2004, you probably have heard, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights was, the language like that was included in that resolution, and he was appointed. It was at that time a Thai professor, now it is a person from Indonesia. But North Korea, of course, rejected the resolution and rejected the special rapporteur. So even though he wanted to enter the country, that has never happened. So it's since 2004, and the first resolution was 2003. We have, now it's almost 10 years, and then still nothing happened. And as NGO, we had to find other means to somehow, make this issue known. Because without international support, you cannot really do anything on any issue. And so, because North Korea is a part of 3 human rights treaty bodies, it's Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, Economic and Social Rights, and also on discrimination against women and child's rights. It voluntarily accessed to these treaties, and then these treaties have monitoring bodies, committees, that kind of invite the representatives, and then the representatives go prepare the report earlier, go there, and then they are simply grilled by independent experts on the situation in the country. So we thought this is a good opportunity, we will start to use that. We started to prepare a lot of reports, interview people, so that we could go whenever there was opportunity with the committee, brief the expert, just for example, a day earlier, and then so that they could, the next day during this official session, they could ask the question that really they didn't have any access. When we went, for example, in 2009, the Committee on the Rights of the Child reviewed the report of North Korea. And when we went there and wanted to meet with the expert, they said that we have no outside information, nothing apart from the UN bodies that provided us very old information. We have nothing from NGOs. And then we were the only one NGO that was sitting there in the back observing that. That shows how, it's a huge issue, but it shows that what can we do if we don't have support when even smaller countries have numbers of NGOs coming, showing up and providing with the information. And so it was very interesting also for us to observe at that time. The chair of that committee was Korean professor, and she knew Korean. And of course, and so it was very interesting because North Koreans brought translator, and normally when you have this kind of meetings, you have to have at least 2 translators, and they change, right, every 15 minutes usually. And then this woman, for like 6 hours, she was continuously by herself doing translation. So then there was a lot of mistakes that she was not able to follow everything. And that was really, for us, that was, it was really fortunate that the chair was a Korean person, because she understood, and she sometimes could catch what the North Koreans said and confront them on that, and tell the experts that it was wrong. So, for example, one of such issue was, we told the experts about the situation, about the fact that very often in North Korea, children are under arrest. If their parents escaped and they are under surveillance, they put them in the arrest. And then they started to grill North Koreans on that. And there was very high official who came from Pyongyang, and he got nervous because he wasn't used to this kind of meetings. He got nervous, and he started to just say, certain things that he shouldn't say. And he was, of course, saying that there are no house arrests, and this woman was kind of translating a little bit different. And then at a certain point, he actually mentioned that the children are placed in under an arrest. and then they are, observed. And then she didn't actually translate that, but the chair said, like, wait a minute, what kind of arrest? Children, what kind of children? How old are they? And then it was silence. And so it was very interesting to observe that because, North Koreans are not used to this kind of international interaction. So this is actually an opportunity for NGO to provide a lot of information to experts, and so that they can, because out of the body language and out of the things that are even not mentioned, you can kind of, deduct certain things. We also had interactions with them in the corridor, and then, for example, they knew very well about Citizens Alliance. We provided them with the reports, and we were hoping that they would take these reports to Pyongyang. For us, this is an opportunity that this delegation that is being sent from Pyongyang will come back with this kind of information. And even though they might not do much, at least they have access to information that they normally would not have an access to. And when I talked to the South Korean diplomats, when I worked for the South Korean embassy, it was the same case with them here during the military rule, that they knew that something was going on, for example, arrests and so on, but these were reports from Amnesty and other organizations that they were receiving on their desk, and they exactly knew what's going on. So that is the kind of, an input that we are trying to achieve. But also, we are hoping that they somehow, during this pressure, they will somehow change either the law or the practices. So, for example, the resolution itself puts a huge focus on the treatment of North Koreans being repatriated from China to North Korea, and especially treatment of women and the issue of forced abortions and infanticide. At that time, it was really a prevalent issue, and even though North Korea responded very angrily on this kind of forum, internally, after a certain year, we started to see that certain practices have been changed. And so we really went, to interview several people. What has happened after 2004, when UN Special Rapporteur was appointed, to ask people about that. Really, have you seen any changes in the treatment? And then it was very interesting because many people, for example, they went to China during the time of greatest hunger. So it is middle of the 90s, and then they have been very often deported to North Korea a few times in the meantime. And if they have been deported before 2000 and 2004, and then after that, you clearly see the difference, for example, in the treatment. So some of them told us that, for example, when they were released, they had to sign that the human rights were not violated. Or that one really interview for me was really hilarious, because I asked this woman, how was the treatment when you were deported in the 90s and when you were deported, she was deported in 2006. And she said, well, actually, they deported and I went to this detention center where everyone goes, and they didn't beat me this time. So I asked the guard, why do you treat people so nicely? And it's funny, right? But for her, that was really surprising. Like, she wasn't beaten this time. Well, even if there are differences between the regions and between detention centers and so on. Some of them are notorious for really grave human rights violations. But if there are certain changes, these changes are really small and maybe very frustrating for many people outside. But the thing is, they really translate into people's lives. Simply that, many more lives can be saved. If people are not beaten, if they are, for example, released earlier, that means they have higher chance of survival. So for that, because of that, that was one of the success. We thought that is kind of, the way to go forward with North Korea, despite of what they are saying about, international pressure and so on, that we have to push on that. And so we started to do a lot of reports like that on children, on torture, on women's issues, and just recently, you know, this was 2010, for example, after our reports on women and children, they actually implemented a new law on women and children in 2010. The thing is, like, you know, what they implement and the practice, of course, is totally different. I mean, in North Korea, making a law doesn't mean anything, because apart from that law, there will be some kind of annexes and other instructions that will actually violate people's rights. So the law might be really including the human rights language and really protection, you know, of the people's rights, but then it will not really translate into anything unless there are instructions from the top that that actually kind of change these practices. But still, we decided that we have to push forward. The problem was that at a certain point, North Korea decided that they will not show up for these committees. I don't know what is the reasoning, but I think that, first of all, it is very difficult for them to prepare for this kind of committees reviews, because they have to prepare a detailed information. They don't have really statistics in the country, so they make up the statistics, and it's really funny when the experts are seeing that. They say, like, for example, they have 2 women in jails, you know. It's really ridiculous. So it's very difficult to even talk to them, and then at the same time they don't want to get any technical cooperation that would help them to kind of, you know, and teach them how to do certain things, how to prepare for this kind of human rights reporting. And secondly is that this briefings, and also this review is very detailed. So for them, a lot of information that they don't really want to say sometimes can be said at this fora. So they sometimes, I think that's why they decided to also avoid it. But also I think the problem was that when the Human Rights Commission underwent the reform, and now it's Human Rights Council, they invented a new system which is called Universal Periodic Review. And for that review, every country has to show up every 4 years. So it's very simple, actually. So you have just, and it's not the experts that are interviewing the countries. You have the diplomats that were given some kind of information, either from UN bodies or from their own information, or in missions if they have, for example, in Pyongyang or somewhere else, and then from NGOs. And they can just ask North Koreans about the situation of women, of children, and things like that. And so it's not very specific. It's kind of like very diplomatic talk, just sitting nicely and politely asking them questions. And it's very easy for many countries that they started kind of to use this mechanism instead of other mechanisms that are more substantial, which I think is a huge problem. Because you cannot really review a country upon this kind of review. And North Korea underwent the review, and we prepared our report, and we also met with many diplomats, and a lot of information went to the questions. So we see that the human rights community, or anyone actually who is involved in this kind of issues, can ask its own government to put certain issues on the table and talk about it on the Human Rights Council forum. Whether this is UPR or Human Rights Council session, it's not only NGOs, like every person can write even to the government, you know, to your representatives. And even here, the embassies, and write what you are doing on human rights, and I want you to raise certain issue. That's also possible. But then the thing is that it's very limited. How big impact it will have also, well, we'll see. I mean, after this first review, they only changed this law on women and children, and we'll see. We will, interview some women and children for the upcoming also UPR interview, UPR review, because there will be another North Korea UPR review. So we have to prepare in advance, and we will see whether there have been any changes in 2010 or 2011. And then we will again put that information into some kind of short report and meet with diplomats, and that's how we usually, it's very repetitive work, but that's how we can somehow improve this situation, is how we view that. And so that is where we are now as the organization. But there have been also certain changes during the time when I mentioned to you when I came here in 2004. Really, that issue wasn't that known. Now we have resolution every year at the Human Rights Council and at the UN General Assembly. We have special rapporteur that has to do report on human rights every year, and the issue became known because you don't have actually a newspaper that wouldn't, especially Western newspapers, the biggest one, that wouldn't touch upon the issue of human rights in North Korea. And then actually when we have a lot of contacts because of the contacts with diplomats, and in Geneva we also meet a lot of journalists and other NGOs. So a lot of newspapers from the very small countries, whether these are African countries or Latin American countries, they actually contact us and ask to interview North Koreans here, and they also write in their language. And that is very important because what I found out that is kind of like what you can also do is that not everyone speaks English, and for many people, because English became of course, prevalent language to be used in so many settings. We sometimes forget that we cannot reach certain areas without translating that information. And that was the thing that we realized, that many African NGOs or South American NGOs were saying, well, do you have information in any other language? We cannot use it. And so was with the diplomats. When we started to really, meet the diplomats, we realized that many of them said, please speak French or please speak Spanish. And that is the point where we are at right now, that we have, there are many NGOs in South Korea, not many that are doing this kind of work internationally in terms of lobbying and in terms of providing information. And then there isn't really much information in other languages. There is a lot of information being produced here, a lot of reports, a lot of movies, but they are translated mostly into English. Even when you have them uploaded online, they are in English. So for example, last year when we realized that it's really a huge problem, we produced some of the documentaries that would touch upon different issues, and we translated them into Chinese, Spanish, and French, so that they will be available for the communities, broader communities. And also, while talking to many diplomats, we realized that there isn't enough network, that there was network being created between South Korean NGOs and Western NGOs, European, American mostly. There isn't really NGO network that would go into African countries or South American countries or even Southeast Asia. And we realized that it is really necessary these days in order to really bring this issue to the forefront. Because when we went in March, I went again to Geneva for the session of the Human Rights Council. I met many diplomats from African countries and also Southeast Asian countries, and they said, that was the argument, that they would vote on the Syrian resolution, for example, but they would not vote on the North Korean resolution, because they said that it's not visible. Syrian situation is visible. You know about it. You just cannot avoid information. You have it every day on your desk. While North Korean situation is just lying low. It's just the resolution. Every year, table done. Forget it. you know, and then another year, done, forget it. That's it. And they think that really nothing is going on there. So we realized that that is really a crisis for us as NGOs and for international community, because you have much more serious situation that has been going there for years, and then diplomats, international communities thinking that it is actually not that serious. So we decided to actually, you know, translate a lot of our publications into different languages, but also to network with NGOs from Brazil, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, so that, well, it is very expensive to go to these places, but we've realized that simply by asking them to join the network, those who will be interested, that we would provide them with information with the movies, and they, because they do lobbying on different issues vis-a-vis their home governments, they would also include North Korean government to lobby their government about what's going on. And this is where we are at. We are just, I feel like we are starting again all over, that we have achieved so much and the issue, you know, became recognized, and then at a certain point people became too accustomed to the fact that there are human rights violations in North Korea and nothing will ever change. So there is nothing else to be done. And I think that is, you know, one of the, I think, also kind of, you know, a part of the activity that you can do, I think, is if you have any friends, you know, or if you have, for example, a knowledge of certain languages, to kind of translate that or produce movies. These days, there are people who want to, for example, they don't know much about the human rights issues, but they have lived here, taught here, and then they want to, for example, just do simple movies about North Koreans living here or the situation, the human rights situation, post it online, and so that the situation spreads in many languages, that we will make this information visible and accessible for many people, and then that it really is a serious problem. That's what we have to stress. So this is where we actually restructured this year our organization, and we decided to really put a lot of efforts into campaign and into research and campaign, and that will be most of our work. Our work is also shortly, just I will tell you shortly that when we just started in the 90s, there wasn't really a system for North Koreans that were coming here and resettling in South Korea, because the governmental system was really established by the law in 1999, and then Hanawon was established and other programs were established. So before that, there were only NGOs, churches that were actively helping those who were coming here. And our NGO actually, because it started in 1996, we developed these programs at first for women and children. That is somehow another line of our activities, which is not international. I mean, it is international only in terms of raising the issue of the situation in China, for example. But other than that, we focus mostly right now on children and youth, just because they adapt much easier to the South Korean society. And then we hope that, because many North Koreans actually want to come back one day to their country, it's just the situation that prevents them from doing that. But they miss their homes, their friends very often. And we hope that if there is a situation that allows for that, some kind of reunification or any other situation that will allow them to come back, they will be these active players, because they were born and raised in North Korea for the time being, but then they were educated in South Korea, and then they have certain knowledge in various sectors, like for example, whether they are economists, journalists, or human rights activists, and they will go back to North Korea and set up certain institutions or do training, whatever. But this is actually, many NGOs when we meet with people outside, they ask us, "You are really human rights watchdog. Why do you do these adjustment programs?" But for us, it's really historical because of the problem of the lack of support for, and still this is, despite so many years, still there are problems in the system of support. So I think NGOs and individuals, churches, or any other groups are really necessary, even governments, other governments, to support the adjustment. But also it gives us somehow input to what's going on, because we have continuous contact with those who arrive recently, their parents. And also, we realized that we cannot monitor only the situation in North Korea. We have to monitor what's going on here in South Korea and how their rights are violated. So we kind of never agreed to give up on these programs, and we continue to do that. But our really priority from this year will be strengthening our international campaign. I think I would stop here because I feel a little hot. But if you have any questions, I would welcome your questions. And yes, please.
You mentioned at the beginning when you were speaking about three treaties or three treaties that North Korea had signed on to in the United Nations. I believe you said they were related to human rights. They were all three of them were related to human rights, correct?
So these are four treaties. 4 treaties related to human rights? Yes. So we have different kind of treaties at the UN, right? Like Treaty on Civil and Political Rights, Treaty on Economic, Social Rights, Treaty on the Rights of Children, or Discrimination against Women, or there are also many other, like discrimination, like race discrimination and so on. So this is on torture and things like that. But North Korea is party only to 4 of them. And they voluntarily, when a country joins the UN, they can also ratify the conventions.
Yeah, my question being, so the ones that you mentioned were all related to human rights. What would have caused them to want to sign on to those? Like, what rationale would make them say, "Oh, we have terrible human rights back home, we should sign these"?
At that time, they were just simply competing with South Korea because they joined at the same time. So they were just, it was a matter of prestige, I think. But then they didn't realize, for them, human rights is not, they don't have really knowledge what kind of work the government has to do in terms of human rights. So they went through these reviews of the committees, but it involved a lot of resources for them and a lot of criticism that they also, got through these committees. So I think that's when they stopped actually submitting their reports and going through the review. Because if they don't submit the report, the committee cannot ask them to come for the review.
I think when we think about North Korea, a lot of times we think of it as this monolithic actor, and that consciously or deliberately uses, terror or whatnot to propagate the regime. But there's also a lot of variation within the country, and I wonder, and also the failing economy and the infrastructure make it increasingly difficult for the center to regulate or monitor the activities regionally or in the provinces or counties. So I wonder, are there cases where how do you understand the structure of human rights abuses in North Korea? I mean, how do you see it as these are abuses perpetuated by the state? Are these outliers of detention facilities that lack regulation from the state? Are these the result of the absence of policies that would protect, from. How do you have a concept of like why and how, other than just big bad North Korea government?
I would say that this is a very interesting question because, well, definitely there is involvement of the state. And despite the activities, for example, reviewing the constitution, putting human rights there, or reviewing the law, they also provide certain instructions or annexes that are very often secret that allow prosecutors or guards in prisons to actually violate people's rights or execute them even arbitrarily. So this is like two bodies. One is official law, another one are separate instructions. And these instructions are coming from the top. Separately, there are instructions from the leader himself. In the past, Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un, like for example, when Kim Jong-il died, and then there was a report that Kim Jong-un instructed to execute everyone, the family, 3 generations of those who would cross during this mourning period, would cross the border. So these are also certain instructions that the leader, the top leader, gives that actually are, in opposition to what is in the law. But definitely, what you mentioned with the fact that the system is somehow breaking. Like Pyongyang is an island, and then there are people, and then there are differences, economic differences. More and more, poorer are getting poorer, and richer are getting richer. Really, it is the case these days in North Korea. Those who have power and privileges, they have an access to resources. And these resources allow them also to abuse people further. And this is separately from what's going on. The government doesn't need to even know about that, or may allow for that. For example, the corruption is growing in North Korea. It's rampant, really, these days. And when you have these black markets also in North Korea operating, people these days have to pay for protection, some kind of taxes. And then that means, or also there are certain gangs that kind of operate and take some goods from people. And this is not being stopped just because, it's kind of like a security valve for the regime. What would you do with these people, the military, and they don't have access to food, and then they are used to this kind of easy earnings. They don't want to work like these normal commoners. So then you would face a situation where they might rebel against the regime, So it's better that they allow them for this kind of activities because they get resources through that. And that's how this system operates. But also, for example, like when they provided clothes, like for teachers in the past, when there was a hunger, and then they realized that many teachers did not want to teach at school because they also had to support their families and earn some kind of money or start some kind of activity. They allocated the plots for them, and then the teachers started to use children from school to work on these private plots. So this is again not stopped by the regime, and of course with this type of with this type of a country, I think you always have this kind of situation that certain things come from the top, but sometimes the top doesn't necessarily have to know about what's going on in other areas. I remember like when we were during communist times, that we had a joke in Poland and in Soviet Union. There was a joke that the government needed a statistics, like how many cows we have in every region, every province. And so this is actually true. When it went down to local party members, they were really scared to report that there are no cows. That is the case also in North Korea, which is not necessarily cow, but something else. So they put whatever. It is not being checked, and then it's reported higher. And then they looked and it's like, only 6 cows? Oh no, they will punish us. Let's make it 12. And by the time it went to the Central Committee of the People's Worker Party, it became like, thousands. And then the party members saw it, it's like, great, what a rich country. And so that is how I think, I really like this job because it shows how it also operates in North Korea. People are afraid also to report on certain issues and report false information that the regime may not know. That's why our work is also important, because when we provide the information, when we meet with the North Korean officials on this kind of forum like Human Rights Council and provide them with the report and talk to them, they have some kind of other information. They are confronted like, even if they don't believe and they think that is propaganda, maybe some kind of doubt arises there. And the same thing was like, for example, the professor of economy in Poland, who was advisor to Lech Wałęsa, he was always telling a joke that his students, during martial law in Poland, it was like in North Korea. We didn't have anything. You would go to the stores, the markets, and the shelves would be empty. You would just have vinegar. And then you would receive this kind of coupons on which there was like 500 grams of this type of meat, 300 grams of sugar, and 1 chocolate for children, and then 1 pair of shoes for 6 months. And of course you went there, you stood in the queue, and there was nothing, even though it was on these coupons in the shop. Really, there was nothing. And you had to stay in these long queues for hours and hours, sometimes whole night. And then the whole family would stay in this queue waiting for shoes, pair of shoes. But then he was saying that he was teaching his students, and they asked him, Professor, in the newspapers they say that there is so much meat, so much production of meat, how come we don't have it in the shops? And he said, like, if you have that in the newspaper, how come can you have it in the shop? So that is the case, I think, with this type of societies, but this was a very good question.
You mentioned when you first started there was still a lot of existing ties between kind of the Eastern-bloc and North Korea, although there shouldn't have been theoretically, there were still a lot of ties. How have you in the past, or how do you think NGOs can pressure North Korean allies effectively? Or in the UN institutions you've seen, how can, instead of always targeting North Korea, how can the other members or the UN bodies target North Korean allies? Not necessarily just China, but anyone else.
I think there will always be a problem. You will always have people who somehow will not change. It's the same in Poland. We still have a parliamentary group that goes to North Korea, which is like previous communists, which became social democrats, and then they still have contacts and some kind of strange, probably business contacts, and many of these countries will function like that. But I think the only way is through this kind of networking with the NGOs in that country, simply. So, for example, Malaysia, they still maintain relations with North Korea and with South Korea. They accept many workers from North Korea, and some businesses operate there. So I think this is the only kind of way for us to press the government, because when we talk to government, they present us with the official kind of opinion and what they will do for the future. I think without this kind of continuous pressure, it will not change. And that's what happened, like, for example, when we had the issue of North Korean workers in countries of Poland and Czech Republic. And, these workers, they are like slaves, and they are in jail. They work, for example, in shoe factory or shipyard, and then they cannot communicate with local workers. They always are assigned guards, like party members, and they go by bus. They cannot go outside without, like, only, for example, they will just gather products that they need, for example, to buy. and the 2 or 3 people will be selected, and they will be watched, and they will go to the department store, buy it, and again, go back. They cannot go outside, they cannot visit, they don't have any contact. For them, it was always an opportunity to, earn money, because however little they earned there, they were happy even if they saved $100 or $200, because it's a lot in North Korea. But for normal people in this country, that was problematic, like the way that they lived. And especially, like, for example, here in South Korea, we had one of the North Koreans that escaped from Czech Republic, and he was responsible for these North Korean women's workers in Czech. And then he brought these stories how these women are really living without any health care, that they eat, for example, pasta every day, the cheapest one, to save, because even though they were earning $150, part of it was cut and was sent directly to Pyongyang. And then out of what they would normally receive, there were further voluntary funds. So, for example, a fund for flour for Kim Il-sung, a fund for flour for Kim Jong-il, a fund for newspapers, a fund for movies, North Korean movies, and they had to pay. And so he was saying that the real salary was like $20 that they were receiving. And I'm like, in Poland even at that time, live by $20 a month and you save from that? It's just impossible. So he was saying about these health issues and so on, and we just realized that we cannot continue with that. So there was a lot of pressure from the local newspapers and NGOs that because these countries are part now of European Union, they cannot actually allow to take these workers and allow for this kind of conditions. Yes, if the conditions change, fine. And then they had to close these factories. They had to send these workers back. But I think that's the only way that we can somehow, work with these countries who have had in the past and now still have relations with North Korea.
Can you take the last question for her?
Oh, hi.
I have a question more about your organization, and I'll pose it to Dan too. If you could get money, like 20 million, 50 million won, in your budget, under your control, what's an activity that you would either launch or something that you would expand that you're already doing?
Difficult question. Privately, we talked once about that, but I really always wanted to make a foundation for children, a simply foundation that would teach them not only useful skills. Many governments started to work on the English skills, which is very important activity, I think, but they don't know about the world really. Like for example, what certain companies are doing. So I would just simply make certain programs for them where they would just simply be able to have mentors from the areas that they are interested in, and then they can know better how these companies, or how simply go with them, visit different kind of places, whether these are media or these are companies, so that they can somehow create idea what they want to do in the future, because many of them focus on choosing very typical topics, like for example they study Chinese or they study business management, but I think we have to somehow broaden this scope, and then it's very difficult for them sometimes to really realize how this society, such as society, is really functioning, because they haven't seen that in their own society. So I think I would definitely do something like that to improve that they adjust better here, because I think they are the chance for us and for North Korea, I think.
get this, your